The Scottish brand Deviate is best known for developing and popularising the high pivot suspension layout on modern mountain bikes, and the Highlander II is the brand's trail bike that gets that very tech. And while its intentions are fairly simple, the brand has done a fantastic job in developing a fantastic UK-friendly trail bike. And it's no slouch almost anywhere, and in fact it's very easy to ride incredibly quickly. And this is the full review. As Deviate's trail mountain bike, the Highlander II is built to do a little bit of everything, whether that's big mountain epics or hard efforts in between the tapes. And to do that, the brand has given the bike 29-inch wheels at both ends, 145mm of travel at the rear and 160mm at the front. And as a bike that's built in the UK, it's filled with UK-friendly features, and a favourite of mine is what Deviate calls the cable gully system. And this is it's what it says on the tin basically. So it's a gully that runs underneath the top tube where the cables run. And as you can probably see, it looks really smart and you can hardly see the cables. But what that also means is that at the front end of the bike, the cables are externally routed apart from the dropper post, which is really good because it helps with maintenance and it makes threading the hoses through the frame a little bit easier. Towards the rear triangle is internally cable routed, and that's also really good because it protects the cables and hoses from any damage from flung rocks and things like that. It also looks mega tidy still. And speaking of easy maintenance, the Highlander II has a grease injection port at each pivot. And this is really good because you can essentially just inject fresh grease into where the bearings are, and dirty stuff will come out. It's a technique or a method that's used often in industry, and it acts as a better barrier against dirt and moisture. Elsewhere, we've got a threaded bottom bracket, a really neat looking down tube protector, and there's an 18-tooth idler pulley, which leads me very nicely onto this bike's suspension platform. So Deviate is one of few brands that only offers high pivot suspension mountain bikes, and the brand has a lot of faith behind this system, and it says that there are a lot of benefits. One of those is that the brand has built in 127% anti-rise, so when you're hard on the brakes, typically a bike will lift and it will throw weight forwards, so the rear suspension will extend. But on this bike, it's actually designed to compress, so it should retain its geometry when under heavy braking loads. But perhaps the main benefit is that it provides a more rearward axle path. So all mountain bikes have some kind of rearwards axle path, but with this high pivot platform, Deviate has managed to get the chainstay to extend by 23mm. And the whole idea of this is to allow the rear wheel to roll over bumps much easier rather than get hung up on them as you might do with a traditional platform. So as for the geometry, and it's clearly a trail mountain bike, but it's quite a progressive one. So this is a large frame and it gets a 490mm reach, which is by no means short. And there's a 65-degree head tube angle. And while for a bike like this, you might expect something a little bit slacker, Deviate has pulled that front wheel in a little bit to kind of balance stability with agility basically. Towards the rear end, we've got a 441-degree chainstay when it's not compressed, and there is a 77-degree seat tube angle. Finally, the wheelbase on this large frame measures in at 1,258mm. So what's really worth mentioning is the Highlander II's ridiculous standover. It measures in at 685, we've got a 430mm seat tube, and here I've got a 240mm dropper post. I'm 5'10" and I fit on this perfectly, and then this offers tons of space over the back of the bike. It's really good stuff to see. And onto the componentry, and Deviate does things a little bit differently than other brands. They have three main Pro builds, which this is the Pro Build Zero. But then the brand also goes a similar way to Starling and Bird and things like that, where you can pick and choose componentry from what they offer. So you can go for a mostly custom build if you wanted to. But this Pro Build Zero will cost you £7,000, and while it is a chunk of money, I think the brand has been rather generous here, because as you can see, we've got a full suite of Öhlins suspension. At the front, we have an RXF 36 M.2, of course, with 160mm suspension, and at the rear, we have the TTX Air. As for shifting, there's a Shimano XT drivetrain, And that's where this bike kind of changes a little bit. So as a test bike, this has just had some small changes in componentry. So we've got an SLX shifter here. The XT brakes come as standard, they're 4-pot, which is great to see. And the Industry 9 Hydra hubs come as standard on this build. Where things change a little bit are the rims. So I've got DT Swiss rims here, but usually it's laced with, again, Industry 9 rims. So it's a pretty good build for the money. Wrapping up the build, as for finishing kit, that comes from One Up Components, and I really like the stuff that they create. So we've got the carbon handlebar here, and we've got the V2 dropper. I do have to apologise, I'm very sorry about my tyre setup. I've run this bike with loads of different tyres, and I didn't want to get Deviates all muddy. So as standard, this bike will come with a Vittoria Mazza at the front and a Martello at the rear. But what's also great to see from Deviate is that although you can buy custom builds, you can kind of slightly customize the pro builds. So upon checkout, you can pick the rise of your handlebar, the length of your stem, and the travel of your dropper post, which is a really nice touch to see. It means you can personalize it to your exacting details. So onto the ride, and I've got to admit, this bike took quite a bit of learning because it's actually quite different to the generally horse-linked bikes that I've been riding. But one thing is sure, the brand's claims of versatility with this bike ring absolutely true. So during my time with this bike, it saw bike park trips, it saw steeper natural riding, and then more mellow local stuff. So it's seen a good breadth of different kinds of riding. And there are areas where it is very, very good, but there are other areas where it's absolutely at home. But if we start with how this bike is to climb, and it's absolutely no slouch. I mean, it's not perfect. There's some bob and movement in the suspension as you pedal, but it transfers a lot of energy to forward momentum. It's a rather comfortable place to be where the seat tube distributes weight rather centrally, but not overly so. And the 43mm stem on this particular bike makes for a super roomy cockpit. But there have been times where I've kind of thought maybe I need a shorter stem or maybe a slightly steeper seat tube. But if we go back to this bike's kind of versatility kind of focus, it makes a lot of sense. It distributes weight fairly evenly over the bike while still feeling quite progressive and planted. Importantly, the Highlander II is rather efficient. It's by no means perfect, but it's easy going and cranking uphill and generally very pleasant to pedal at. I say it's not perfect because there's some movement in the shock and the pedalling loads, so some energy has been lost to this movement. However, that movement pays back in traction, where the suspension keeps the rear wheel glued to the ground and stops harsh impacts being transmitted directly to the saddle. Now onto the idle pulley, and there's a lot of preconceptions about this little bit of tech. On this bike, they're kind of blown out the window. So in theory, it makes sense that there is more friction and drag in this system because there's another thing for the chain to go around. So again, there's more friction in the chain, and there is another bearing to get moving as well. However, under pedaling, I've not noticed any drag at all, really. You'd have to be really picky to find any kind of drag in this system. I think it's quite good. However, it can get noisy. So with a clean chain or a completely clean bike, everything's nice and quiet. It feels exactly and sounds exactly like a normal mountain bike. But when this bike gets some mud in its chain and mud in the gears and stuff like that, it does get a little bit vocal. For me, it doesn't bother me personally, but if you like the quietest of bikes all of the time, you might want to steer clear a little bit, or just maintain it better. On the descents is where the Highlander II comes to life, as its sprightly pedaling performance translates very well, but it takes full advantage of the high pivot platform. Because the axle path is so much more rearwards than on conventional bikes, it transmits far less trail chatter to the feet, so it makes riding at speed very comfortable and easy to do. Because of how its suspension performs, it gains momentum regardless of the terrain you're riding, whether it's smooth flow or proper chunky terrain. And in the latter, it's massively impressive how much momentum you can gain. Of course, if the bike encourages fast riding, there's a greater reliance on solid braking, and braking is certainly solid on this bike. And that's all where the 127% of anti-rise kicks in. When proper hauling on the anchors, the bike's geometry it does stay very balanced. The weight isn't thrown towards the front, and it means that you can confidently brake in really rough sections without getting all that harshness in the rear end. So where it's really confident at speed, it's equally as confident when you're trying to slow down. But that said, it is a very different feeling though, or different to what I've been used to on regular bikes. So it's something you kind of get used to. In fact, the whole relationship between the bike's axle path and geometry is something that needs some quality time to get to grips with. The more rearward axle path makes the chainstay grow when suspension is compressed, and in many cases this is a great thing. And that's because it adds stability as the suspension is compressed. So as you're going through rocky or chunky terrain, your suspension will typically compress, the bike will get longer and it will get more stable. So it makes negotiating such terrain much easier. The suspension helps with negotiating tech as it absorbs all of the hits while gaining in stability. The Highlander II is unfazed by choppy terrain, and to the point where the rear suspension's performance outshines that of the fork. The extension of the chainstay isn't without its compromises though, and it affects the bike's cornering. Of course, when cornering, the suspension compresses, and on this bike the wheelbase extends, which isn't ideal for fast corners. However, it is something you get used to, and it's taken a little bit of rethinking my cornering technique. The bike loves a front-weighted riding position, which not only helps improve traction at the front wheel, but helps the bike come around the corner through minimising compression of the rear suspension. I also found that setting up earlier for the corner helps quite a lot too. But this is where that steeper head tube comes into play, as it claws back some agility on flatter terrain. It does have some kind of compromise when it comes to steeper stuff, as it can be a little bit twitchy. It's more about the general intention of this bike rather than one small scenario. Because of this growth in the wheelbase and the compression, this bike makes quite a good argument for sizing down, in fact. I'm 5'10", and I'm right on the cusp of both sizes, and there are areas where cornering is a little bit tougher. But yeah, going for the shorter bike, which I believe has a 460mm reach, it will balance agility with the stability that the growth in wheelbase offers. Wrapping up the performance, and the bike's stiffness in the corners is really good. It's actually quite impressive. This is a linkage-driven single pivot, and sometimes single pivots layouts can be a little bit bendy. But as you can see, everything towards the rear end and even the front end is quite overbuilt, and that retains stiffness, and you can really feel that in the corners. So as we move on to the value, and the £7,000 kind of space is rife with other very competitive high pivot suspension mountain bikes, and one of the newest ones is Norco's Sight C2. That gets 150mm suspension at the rear with 160 at the front. Its geometry is a little different, but you get RockShox's ultimate suspension and you save £500. But some bits and bobs aren't quite as luscious as what you get on here, so there's a Trans-X dropper, for example. Another bike, of course, we can't talk high pivot without talking about Forbidden, and for the same money you can get the Forbidden Druid, which gets 150mm suspension at the front, 130 at the rear, so it's a little bit less than this. But in terms of the components, you get RockShox's ultimate level suspension, and you get SRAM's GX T-Type drivetrain. That is the GX RS Plus build of the Druid, and that will set you back the same money. But what's worth mentioning is that a Druid frame will cost you £3,600, whereas a Highlander II frame, that's just £3,000. And if you want to go for last year's spec frame, which gets the non-UDH rear end, you save some money still. They're doing a deal on that at the moment. It's well worth looking at if you're looking at this bike. Although the Deviate Highlander II took a little bit of getting used to, it's a bike that I've grown quite fond of. Again, it's not perfect, and it takes learning to kind of make the most of it. But it's one of very few bikes that actually managed to blend the responsiveness and trail character of a mid-travel trail bike with the absolute forgiveness of a 170mm Enduro bike. And if that's the kind of riding that you want to do, well, this is your bike. So that is the full review of the Deviate Highlander Pro Build Zero. If you want to see a more in-depth written review, head over to www.off-road.cc where you'll find that. But if you want to see more videos just like this, please like and subscribe. And thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.